Well, to everyone tuning in today, just a big happy holidays, Merry Christmas. I love this time of year. As you can see, there's this tree behind me. I'm preparing for Christmas myself. After I finish this lecture, I'll probably wrap up some gifts and just enjoy the holiday spirit. I have to say, I'm someone who just loves Christmas time. It just gives me this feeling of holiness, of sacredness. It makes me think about being a better person. How can I be more charitable, more humble, more loving? And many times in my life, I've gone to services around Christmas time and heard beautiful carols and heard people talking about how to live a life of giving. And I've often looked up at the statues of Jesus during these different sermons and caroling activities. And growing up, I always thought I could never be like Jesus, or I could never really be even like a disciple of Jesus. They always seem to be depicted in churches as just otherworldly sages or saints. And when I was in college, I just got enamored with this idea of actually experiencing God. If God is real, if there's a purpose to life, I thought, I want to know it. And I started to study what's called perennial philosophy or perennial religion. And that's taking a look at the healing experiences and the ethics and the truths that seem to pop up again and again in different spiritual practices and religions throughout the ages. I was on a deep and honest search for truth. And frankly, I didn't think I was going to land on any one particular perspective that would be the end-all for me. But at the time, I came across a wonderful book called Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, written by a remarkable lady that I'll talk about later, named Mary Baker Eddy. And as I read this book, I felt that sweet sense of sacred, holy calm, that peace, that love that's really at the heart of what we care about. And I felt so good when I was reading that book, and I started to perceive life through a different lens. I started to look at life through what you could call a purely spiritual lens, a purely God-centered and God-imbued way of perceiving reality. And as I did that, just wonderful things started to happen to me. First of all, I started to become less self-conscious. I was very self-conscious at that time in my life. I used to think a lot about how other people perceived me, and I was very shy. In fact, when I was in college, at one point, I was doing personal care work for a woman who was chronically ill, and I helped get her food and do her laundry and do her errands and help her live a more normal life. And every day I would get to her apartment, and I thought, this is the day I'm going to share with her what I'm learning in this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures, that talks about how gaining the spiritual consciousness of life, the natural consciousness of life, brings about harmony in a way that's not supernatural, but supernatural, just the most natural thing in the world. And I just knew that if this woman could really understand what this book was teaching, and I should say, parenthetically, what this book teaches is how to have the same mind that was also in Christ Jesus. That, of course, is a line from the Bible in the book of Philippians. And I think that's a promise that we can begin to have the same perception of life that Jesus had. And when I was reading this book, Science and Health, it started to talk about how spiritual healing and loving like Jesus loved is not something miraculous, actually. It's actually the natural and original condition of being. And actually, when you experience harmony, even when it doesn't appear that it's possible to experience harmony, that is not unusual, because harmony is actually what God is always giving to us. Harmony is actually ever present because God is always ever present. And healing, bringing out harmony in a situation, even if it seems to be impossible, it just is really the most normal thing in the world, because it flows from our perception of God. And God is always present, and God constitutes real consciousness. Well, every day I would get to my friend's house, and I thought, this is the day I'm going to give this gift of healing to her. I'm going to share what's in this book, Science and Health. I'm going to pray for her. Wonderful things are going to happen. And every day I would get there, I was just too shy, too self-conscious, wouldn't say anything at all. And then there came a point where I just realized, okay, I just can't do this by myself. But you know what? That's okay. Because God is what creates and governs all of reality. We all belong to a life that's bigger than our ego or psyche. There's actually a life right now that's creating and sustaining us in this very moment. We don't actually make this moment, do we? Often we think we're self-made. We walk around thinking we need to make something of ourselves. But the world, everything in it, all of us, it's made by something bigger than us. It's made by what you call life itself. And that life that is God, that is really all, the Bible describes as divine love. And the moments in my life where I've really felt the closest to divine love, really at one with divine love, I felt like that is real life. And I remember one day after I visited this woman, I was working for her, and I didn't share with her again about Christian Science, and she was still so ill, and I got back to my car, and I started to pray, and I just started to affirm that God was on the scene. You know, God is all. That love that is God was with this woman, speaking to her, guiding her, and I just knew everything was going to work out. It says in Romans 8:28 in the Bible that all things work together for good to them that love God. And this woman didn't tell me for many years later, but she was kind of embarrassed about this part of the story. But she said, that day you left your book bag at my house, and I was always wondering what you were carrying around in that book bag, and I looked into it, and there was actually a Bible in there, and there was this book that explains the Bible called Science and Health, the Key to the Scriptures, and she started to read those two books, and they really started to change her life. And eventually she asked me, do you know anything about Christian Science? And we started to talk, and I started to pray for her, and within a very short period, she was up out of her bed, taking dance classes, taking art classes. Whole life really turned around. It was just a wonderful transformation. And when I think of Christian Science and what it has brought to my life, it has really given me a sense of the solidity of good, really the law of good, or the law of divine love. And when we talk about something being based upon law that is universal, that applies to everybody, that word science often comes in. Science is from a Latin word that just means knowledge. And in Mary Baker Eddy's day, she lived from 1821 till 1910. If you check up the dictionary she grew up with, Webster's Dictionary of 1828, if you look up the word science in that dictionary, the example sentence of how you would use the word science in a sentence is, the science of God must be perfect. And the definition is essentially understanding truths or facts by the mind. And so when we talk about science in the term Christian Science, we're talking about the knowledge of God. And when Jesus said, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free, or ye shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free, he wasn't talking about just a material law, a pattern that people observe within their physical or material experience. He was talking about the knowledge of God, something much more higher and holier and perfect than any material law. Every material law that we see in life can produce good and bad. Just because something appears to be a material law, and we give that word law to something that we see as repeatable and consistent and observably true. Well, as I started to practice Christian Science in my 20s, like I said, I wasn't really looking for a religion. I was on a search for spiritual truth. I thought that was kind of beyond religion. As I started to read this book, I started to garner insights about reality and about how logical universal love is, and how it's just a false perception of reality that makes us appear to see evil or badness or difficulty, but that God is love itself and never condones bad, never gives us a sickness or difficulty to prove his love in some weird or twisted way. No, every time I was reading this book and felt that sense of divine, infinite love, that helped me see more harmony and goodness in my life. And I remember one time when I was preparing around the holidays. It was a wonderful snowy year here in New England. And I wanted to visit a friend of mine. And there was a big blizzard. And so I was heading out late to go to this party. And to be frank, I was just trying to get there quickly. I was late to the party. And so I wasn't driving overly fast or anything, but I was, hustling along. And I was fine the whole way. I had these new tires in my car, and it was a really good car for the snow, so I wasn't having any problems. But my friend lived up on this mountain top in this small town out in western Massachusetts. And when I started to get up to his house, he would kind of, switch back around these hills. And I was on this windy small road, and it had stopped snowing at this point, so I turned off my wipers, and I was rearing a corner, and a big gust of wind came around this corner, and there was an overhanging pine branch with a lot of snow on it. And all of a sudden, the snow all fell down on my windshield with a big crash. And it was this light, fluffy snow, and so it completely whited me out. And I turned on my windshield wipers, but it took me a while before I could see. And I certainly was trying to slow down at that moment, but I couldn't see where I was going. And by the time the wipers were able to clear the snow on my windshield, it looked like I was headed off the road over this precipice area down this valley, and it was exactly where I did not want to go. And I just reached out to God with my whole heart in that moment, and it was so interesting. It seemed like there were two options before me. The self-will in me wanted to jerk the car back on the road and do the heroic race car driver kind of thing. But there was this gentle voice in that moment that just said, essentially, hit on the brakes. It's going to be okay. And there was a tree right in front of me, and I knew if I hit on the brakes, I would slide into this tree, and the tree would stop me from going down into the valley. And so I hit on the brakes, and the car slid and eventually hit into that tree. And before examining if there was any bodily injuries, before examining the car was clearly totaled. But I just reached out to God with my whole heart again. And this verse from Scripture just came illumined in my thought so brightly. And it was such a simple, just little snippet from the Bible. And this is what it was. It said, I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life. Choose life. And so many ways, life presents to us duality. Like there's life and death, good and bad, health and sickness. And these seem to be both true conditions that we seem to be always vacillating between and witnessing throughout life. That the things are born and things die. That there's bad moments in life, but then out of those grow good moments, and then those moments kind of eventually come down, and there's a depression or a difficult phase, and then it goes back up. And there's all this up and down and back and forth, yin and yang to life. And yet, what I started to learn as I started to study Christian Science is that good and bad really are not opposites. In many ways, you could see it analogous to light and dark. Often we think of light and dark as something totally different. But light is actually something. It's substantial. It's a real thing. But darkness is not something. It's just the lack of light. It is not something at all. And if we went out and took a walk with each other right now into the dark night here and looked up at the beautiful stars, we would see darkness all around us like a blanket, but then there would be pinpricks of light up in the sky. And it seems like the night sky is just vast darkness with maybe just little light here and there. But if you talk to an astronomer or somebody who knows a lot about the physics of light, they would say that actually light is everywhere. It's everywhere in the universe. That's why when the moon shows up, it lights up. It doesn't have any light of its own, and it appears dark all around the moon. But the moon is lighting up because there's actually light everywhere in the sky right there. And something just needs to show up and reflect it. And likewise, what we start to see in Christian Science is the light of God's love is actually everywhere. But it needs something to show up and reflect it. And we, me and you, everyone listening right now, we are designed to reflect and express God's infinite divine love. Now, if you look at the life of Jesus, this Christmas time, it's about celebrating the birth and the life of Jesus. And what was Jesus' life all about? In many ways, people celebrate the birth of Jesus and the death of Jesus, and yet everything I think about Jesus' life was about eternality. It was about the oneness of life, the one thing that's really going on. If you read the Bible and you ask yourself, what is the theme of this book? What's it all about? I would say what it's all about is monotheism, that there really is only one power behind everything in life. That one power is divine love. It's real life. And when you think of Jesus, I think wherever he saw exclusions to the light and love of God, wherever he saw people saying, well, there's health here and that's good, but there's sickness over here, don't go there. Wherever his culture was saying, like, okay, it's good to follow the saints and the religious people, but don't hang around with the tax collectors or prostitutes. They'll give you a bad reputation. You won't be holy if you do that. You won't be doing the right thing. Wherever his religion said, okay, we've got the right religion, we're the Jews, hang out with us, be related with us, but don't relate with people like the Samaritans who are believing something different, who are heretics or religious fools who are believing the wrong thing. What did Jesus do when he saw that apparent duality, that people saying there's light or goodness, love here, but there's darkness and bad stuff over there? He went to where that darkness appeared to be, and he brought the light of love. Right where the medical field of his day said, well, it's good to love, of course, but don't go love those lepers. That's what I think they were saying. What did Jesus do? He went to those lepers, and he brought his understanding of health. And I think health really comes from our understanding, our oneness with God, as you'll hear in this lecture. And he was able to share and impart that to these individuals. And some of them were healed. Some of them felt and experienced that health in a very real and tangible and life-changing way. Right where people were doing the wrong thing, prostituting or ripping people off unfairly as tax collectors, Jesus actually went to those folks. He loved them. He knew that there was goodness in them. He knew that love was the real basis of their life. And he turned around some of their lives. Some of them became his disciples. And of course, right where his own religion, the Jews, as I said, were demonizing the Samaritans, he even one time shared this deep teaching, what the Bible calls sometimes, or it categorizes it as the water of life teaching. He went to a Samaritan woman who had been divorced many times and seemed to be outcast in many ways. And he shared this deep and profound teaching with her and apparently changed her life. Well, I love to think of myself as an aspiring and practicing Christian, because to be a Christian, I think it's to see that oneness of love everywhere. That really, whatever the opposition to love, whether it's evil or darkness or violence or disease, whatever seems to be opposing that what really has power and dominion and life-transforming potential is that truth of the oneness of divine love, the allness of divine love, God. And I want to talk about this today in depth to really get a sense of how this is logical and can bring about goodness into your life. And that this phrase, Christian Science, about getting to understand the law of divine love, the truth that sets us free, that this is something that's really universal. It's for everyone, and it can benefit everyone. Well, this book, Science and Health, it starts with a sentence that for many people has become a kind of a linchpin for the whole book. You can read the whole book and you can get many more ideas than about what is set forth in this first line. And the first line is simply this. It says, "The prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of him, and unselfed love." And I just love that because often when we hear people talk about faith, they talk about it in such a way that it's kind of like what you do when you can't really understand a situation. If there's something beyond reason, you can take a leap of faith, like a leap outside of what is logical, what is knowable. And people say, oh, okay, you have faith in this, you're from this religion or that religion, or maybe you have faith in material science, and that's what you're kind of trusting. But faith, as Jesus talked about it, was not something that was just something that was blind, something that was illogical, something that just required a kind of dogmatic acceptance. I think he understood it as based upon a spiritual understanding of life that was also founded upon real love and the ability to live that love in a way that's not selfish or self-centered. I have thought a lot about this concept of faith over the years, and sometimes faith, it really does require leaving the mere physical sense of reality. There's a symbol that's associated with prayer that I think people acknowledge all around the world that gets at this fact and really points to what the heart of prayer is all about. And so I want to unpack this a bit before we go further. So what is the image that people have for prayer? If you ask somebody, maybe a little child, to draw someone praying, what would they draw? They would probably draw someone down on their knees, their eyes are closed, their hands are folded. I just love this symbol. I have some pictures of it in my home. And I love to think about what that symbol represents. When I look at it, it makes me think a lot about that Christ spirit, that same kind of feeling I get around Christmas time. Now, what does it represent or connote when you see someone down on their knees? What's that all about? I would say it's about humility. And what did Jesus say? I can of my own self do some things. I'm a great carpenter. I'm a really good speaker. But when it gets really hard, I go to God. No, he said, I can of my own self do nothing. Nothing. He really saw that our sense of being self-made or creating our lives was really blasphemous. That really there is one power that's creating and sustaining us. It's divine, infinite love. And I can say that the most precious, wonderful moments of my life haven't been moments when I've, figured something out on my own. They've often been moments where I've really been praying to be moved and motivated by God, and then I've witnessed some kind of what appears to be a miracle or some goodness or joy come about that just seemed so wonderful and perfectly right for the occasion. And in that prayer symbol, you see someone down on their knees. You also see the eyes closed. And that eyes being closed is a wonderful symbol for blocking out our physical or material sense of life. And Jesus, he said we should go into a closet to pray. He was a man of the wilderness, outside a lot. There weren't a lot of closets around. And I think he was talking about really getting somewhere that is free from all these distractions, where we're not just mindlessly using our social media devices or listening to the thoughts of the world, and really listen to God, to that universal love that is everywhere, that is God itself, that really is speaking to each and every one of us. And lastly, that symbol for prayer, the hands coming together. I think this is about the oneness that I've been talking about. Life appears as a duality. It's good and bad, life and death, sickness and health. And yet, in prayer, there's a pleading for an understanding of oneness. And often it seems with our spiritual lives that we have ourselves, a limited mortal, and then there's this infinite God, divine love, or infinite intelligence maybe out there, but we seem to be separate. There seems to be a divide. And in prayer, there's this coming together, this oneness, and often the pleading for it. And what did Jesus say? I and my Father are two, but when I pray, we're relatively close? No, he said, I and my Father are one. And Mary Baker Eddy in this book even breaks the rules of grammar using an interesting word for God, principle. That principle and its idea is one. And I love that, just that real sense of oneness. Well, back to that story I started to tell you about when I was driving to my friend's house out in the winter there, and I was going around this bend that the snow hit the windshield. I was all whited out, and by the time I could see, I was seeming to be headed for that precipice. I eventually did crash, and I reached out to God. I heard that wonderful line about choosing life and not death, and I really, in that moment, chose to close my eyes to all the possible damage and difficulty in this situation. I wanted to get real humble and really understand right there and then that I was at one with God. And when I heard that little line about choosing life, what that meant to me was that I could really choose God. And that darkness or death in that situation, like it appeared to be the death of my car, I did not need to accept that. Well, I looked down then and I realized to my utter joy that I wasn't injured and was able to pry that door open, eventually get out of that car. It was clearly totaled. And I walked out into the beautiful snowy night. I saw this picture one time that reminded me of this day, and it's a wonderful a little depiction of really exactly what I saw there after I walked out of my car. And as I started to pray about this situation, I was praying from that standpoint of oneness, that I was at one with God. You know, often there are a lot of different ideas about God. There's like a pantheistic concept that maybe God is within matter, you know, in certain places. But if it's within a box, you know, matter is really talking about a box, like something is at one place and not another. And something at one area, whether it's a chemical or a person or, you know, an ocean, you know, some aspect of matter affects another aspect of matter. But for it to be materialized, it means to put something in a box. And I don't think God can be put in a box because God is infinite life, infinite love. And when I was praying about this situation with my accident in the car, I really reached out to God and I just started to hear those angels of God's love speaking to me. There's a Christmas carol that I love so much called Silent Night. And I felt like I was walking out there in the silent night. And there's that little line that all is calm, all is light. All is calm, all is light. And just like darkness is not the opposite of light, really light is everywhere, I think calm and the peace of God is everywhere. I hope everyone feels that this Christmas season. And when I reached out to God, I felt this goodness. I knew that all things were working together for good. And somebody pulled over. They brought me back to their home. They made me some tea. They really comforted me. A wonderful angel appearing of God's love. And then I was able to eventually get to my friend's house. And the first thing that my friend said was, "Oh, you just got in this accident? I just bought a new car, and I've been trying to figure out what to do with my old one, and it just feels right in this moment to give it to you." And my friend was pretty well off, and that car he was offering me was even better than my old car. And I thought, oh gosh, I can't take that, but I started to think about it, and he really wanted to give it to me, and so I eventually accepted that. And the one thing I was kicking myself about was that I was a young lad at the time, and I just bought new snow tires for this car of mine. And I just had spent so much money on these tires. I was a pretty poor young person, and I didn't have a lot of money, and I just really didn't want to pay out of pocket for some new tires. I didn't really have the money. And so what I did was I brought the two cars to a mechanic the next day, and the mechanic said, "Oh yeah, that old car is totaled. It's no good." And he said, "This new car, boy, it's great. I looked at it top to bottom. You really got a winner here." And he said, "You're not going to believe this. It just seems like a miracle, but the one thing with your old car that's totally intact, really fine, is those new tires you just bought." And he said, "There are a lot of different tire sizes to cars. You know, if you enter in your information to a car site to buy tires, they ask you a million questions." But he said, "This new car takes the exact same tires as the ones you just bought. I put them on the new car. You are as good as new here. The new car you're driving is just 10 times better than what you had yesterday." And I love that, because when we reach out to God in prayer, often not only do we see our life maybe restoring to normal, or what seemed to be a depression or difficulty resolving itself, but we start to experience the abundance of good. Jesus spoke so much about this sense of the abundance of good, the infinitude of good, and talked about so many parables that relate to that. And he talked about a stream not producing good and bad water. And there really is just one thing going on in life. It's God. There's a lovely image that I like to think about that relates to this, and it's the image of the sun. In many times in my life, I've walked out into nature and I've seen the sun shining through the trees. And if you ever see that image of the sun shining through the trees, you often think about the idea of light. And the thing is, I felt so wonderful and holy thinking about the life of Jesus in my life. But like I said at the beginning, I've often felt that it just wasn't for me, that I couldn't experience that myself, or I couldn't be like Jesus myself. But Jesus took everyday people. He took fishermen and just women who were doing everyday activities, and he took them under his wings, and he taught them and taught them. And he said, "You guys are the light of the world." And he didn't just think of himself as the light of the world. He thought about others who followed in his footsteps. And I don't think what Jesus was teaching was something that was a gift. Some people think that there's a gift, like some people can heal or help others or experience the goodness of God because they've got a gift. In fact, I thought that when I was young. I had a friend who was also named Nate a few doors down from me. His family was very religious. His father was a minister, and my family wasn't very religious or holy at all. And they seemed to have wonderful experiences in their household that I just didn't have. And I thought, well, maybe some people are just born into this, or they have a gift. And it was really a delight when I discovered Christian Science and started studying it, realizing this is something for everyone. It really is. And if you think of it, if you want to have a faith that's based upon understanding, what do you need to understand if you're thinking about God? Well, it's God. You need to understand the one thing that's really going on. If monotheism is the true theory of life, there really is only one source. Well, what is that source? And what is that source doing? Well, at the heart of science and health is the definition of God. And it says that God is incorporeal, divine, supreme, infinite mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, love. And this definition of God is so wonderful. And these different definitions of God, mind, spirit, soul, principle, life, truth, love, they're not describing different gods or different entities. It's the same exact thing, that life is love. But what is love? It's principle. That word principle comes from the same origin as the word prime does. Prime means something that's irreducible. It can't be explained in terms of any other number. And a principle is that which produces harmony, which produces right order and regulation, law, but it can't be explained in terms of anything else. What is the principle of life? It's mind. Mind or consciousness. It's not just a coincidence that it can't be explained in terms of any material theories. If you look around in the world of science these days, you hear a lot about the hard problem of consciousness and how nobody can explain how consciousness or mind arises from any material theory. Well, it's because mind can't be explained by matter. It's not made of matter. It's fundamental. It's what God is. God is infinite mind, real intelligence. And this real intelligence is soul, the source of all beauty and artistry. Soul is spirit, the very opposite of what we call matter, or something being confined or boxed in. I was having some conversations with the church who is sponsoring this lecture. We had a prep meeting and talking about what could be addressed in this talk. And in their town or city of Baltimore, there's often a lot of talk about violence. There's this image that this area of the world can be violent. There's been some TV shows over the years that has depicted this. And there was one member who so beautifully talked about not buying into that stereotype. And when he moved to the city, he experienced such kindness from his neighbors. And I think it was really a testament to his spirituality, his ability to see the goodness in others, that he saw continuity of good. Well, when we talk about this Christmas spirit of bringing light to every dark place in the world and following the footsteps of Jesus, actually doing the things that he did, and this is the heart and soul of what Christian Science is about, I often think about this experience I had going to a prison years ago. I had a friend who lived nearby me, and he so inspired me with this Christly spirit of going out to these prisons and sharing with these inmates in this incredible selfless way. And I just thought that was so cool, and I started to sign up and do the same thing myself. And one time I went to this prison, and this was a prison that was just kind of a maximum security, difficult place to be. And I'd never been any place like that before in my life. And when I got there, this was the prison there in Boston, I was all prayed up. I had prayed all day, just expecting all the good that could come from this. And there was only 2 men who showed up, and I was expecting a big crowd. And at first I was quite disappointed. But then I looked into the hearts of these 2 young men, and it was as if they were saying, I've exhausted my materialistic outlook on life. It's promised a lot, delivered a little. And if God is real, I am ready. And their arms and hands were open to receive. And they just were so humble, so receptive, like little children just kind of waiting to hear, to listen, like kids do sometimes at hearing a bedtime story or something like that. And as I started to talk to these 2 gentlemen, they kept interrupting me, especially the younger one, and he was saying things to me like, Nate, I don't think you get it. He said, I have this criminal father. I came from this terrible place, in these gangs, and it's not just my father being criminal, my grandfather was a criminal, I think it's just in my blood. Well, I was once permanently healed of a blood condition through Christian Science, and I told him a bit about that. But even more importantly, I shared with him some inspiration that I took from that healing and from other healings that I've had in my life, and it has to do with that analogy of light that I mentioned. If God is like the sun, and we are each a ray of light from the sun, then just think about what affects a sunbeam or a sun ray. What affects a sunbeam? So if you saw this beam of light and you said to it, hey man, you got bad blood, you're no good, you're from a bad area of town, it wouldn't affect its shine one bit, right? It wouldn't stop shining. What if you tried to put something physically into it, inject some medicine, or tried to change it physically? Maybe, crash something into that light beam. Would it change its nature at all? No, it wouldn't. And what if you tried to put that light beam into a box? Actually put it into a physical box, bring it into another room, open up that box. Would it be in there? I don't think so. You open up, no, I don't see it. Well, why is it not defined by what people say about it, by what physically occurs in its experience or in its past, or by how it seems to be boxed in? Because honestly, if we ask ourselves how we define ourselves and others, if we're honest about it, really honest, I think we'll say, well, we think about others by what they've said, what other people have said about them, the gossip I've heard about them. We think about them based upon what's physically occurred to them in the past and what has physically happened to them and their physical body and their physicality. And yeah, I define them by how the world has tried to box them in by these different categories like age and race and nationality and what part of town they live in and their vocational history, if they have one. And those things often weigh heavily on our thought. And so just like if you're from a city that has a bad reputation, or actually think of Jesus. He was from Nazareth. And at least one person said, what good can come of Nazareth in the Bible? And Jesus, he started to talk about himself not as Jesus of Nazareth, but as the Son of God. And that really is right identification. I think Jesus was able to bring so much good into people's lives because he identified himself not from a limited perspective, from a town, place, a physical body, but he was the Son of Spirit, of God, of divine love, the principle of real life, infinite mind. And so Jesus, he really saw himself differently. And so when I was in the prison that day, I started to talk to these guys and explain to who they were as the expressions of God, and that there was no darkness in them. You know, I love thinking about Christmas, and there's all these beautiful scenes of light around Jesus and the birth of Jesus. And in the Bible, in the book of John, it talks about, you know, in Jesus there was light and the darkness could not comprehend it. Because there is no darkness where there is light, right? And so when I was sharing with these men in the prison, I started to really try to give them a sense of identity from God and not from any material word or past history or definition of the world that has seemed to box them in unfairly. And you could see the light bulbs start to go off for these two men, especially the younger one that I was talking to. You could start to hear him say mentally, well, if this is true, maybe my whole life could be different. I've been thinking myself as the product of this, father. But what did Jesus say? He said, call no man on earth your father. Why? Because people used to think that they were defined by their father, that whatever the father did, they did. Whatever, religion their father had is the religion that they are. The way that their father thought, that's the way that they should think. And it was a very tribal and limited, boxed-in way of thinking. And Jesus said, call no man on earth your father. He wasn't anti-family. He was talking about a metaphysical principle about really defining yourself by God and not by other people or any limited materialistic thinking. Well, as I was sharing with these two men about these concepts, I could really see that this sense of being defined by God started to mean a lot to them. And it started to sink into them. It started to really take root in their thought. And they took copies of these books. They took a Bible and they took a Science and Health, and they went back to their cells. They started to study those books. And a couple weeks later, well, maybe about 5-6 weeks later, I come back to this jail. At this point, the younger man was there, and he looked totally different than he looked before. He was just beaming with joy. It looked like he was on cloud 9. And he had all these friends with him, a big crowd, and it was like, these are my guys, right? And he was sitting in the back with this, just this winsome smile. And we got going quickly, so I didn't get to talk to him before I gave this little informal Christian Science service. But as I was sharing ideas from the Bible and Science and Health, I kept eyeing him. And to be totally frank, I was just ready to kind of get that over with, because I really wanted to talk to him. And at the end of that service, he just sauntered up to me nice and slow and he said, "Hey, Nate, I got a testimony for you." And I said, "Okay, well, what is it?" And he said, "Well, um, when I came into this jail, I had been diagnosed with lung cancer." And he said, "I was really suffering. And I really didn't want to take this, what seemed to be an invasive operation. And so I heard over the intercom that this was going to be a healing service. And so I came expecting healing." And he said, "You shared those words with me. I started to really consider them. I started to read those 2 books. And he said, frankly, I don't know what happened to me, but all the symptoms just vanished." And he said, my buddies were saying, it's probably just a relapse. It'll come back. And he waited week after week, week after week, week after week, didn't come back. And there he was that day, just a shining example of what I would call a child of God, a child of God. And what does it mean to be a child of God? If you haven't read your Bible in a while, wonderful place to start is Matthew 5, 6, and 7, what's called the Sermon on the Mount. And in those chapters, what you see is these qualities of thought being identified. It starts off saying, "Blessed are those that," and Jesus starts to identify all these qualities: meekness and humility and striving for righteousness and being a peacemaker. All these qualities of thought that really define the Christian. And these are qualities that come from God, so we can infinitely lean into them. We don't ever become too humble or too loving or too peacemaking. You can just strive to be those more and more, and they just keep on giving. And the world seems to be very materialistic right now. There's this concept that if you give something away, you have less. You have less if you give something away. That's the kind of concept of matter. If this is a piece of matter and I give it to somebody else, I will have less things, right? But what spirituality, true spirituality, as expressed in Christian Science, shows is that when we give something away, we actually have, and we can begin to recognize more of it. So for example, anything that's right that comes from God, God is love. So if I express love, I give love away, and give it away, and give it away, and give it away. I don't have less love. I start to recognize love more and more all around me. And when I was in that jail that day, just volunteering there and just giving the love away to those men started to feel that love. And that love is the basis of real health. That's healthy activity, really seeing the goodness in these men. Now, there's an analogy I love to think about that has to do with mathematics. And you think about God as principle. We can think about the principle of math. And math is something that applies to everybody. It's universal. It wasn't born one day. It's never going to die at another day. It's not subject to the laws of evolution or any materialistic theory of birth. Nobody talks about the birth of mathematics. It just is. Just is. Always has been. It's not going to die. Mathematics is not going to die in some, 2046. And if you think about it, every number in the mathematical system is needed. It has its niche. It has its perfection. And it's really needed as an idea, not as a material representation, as a mental idea. So if you think about it, if the idea of 1,643 disappeared right now, you've probably never thought about that number before, or maybe you've never written it in your life. But if that number just disappeared, I guarantee you this live stream would stop working. My computer would stop working. That number is needed to reality. The banking systems around the world would instantly crash. Stock market would crash. All because that idea that nobody could think it or represent it. But if you wrote that number on a piece of paper or chalkboard and erased it, nothing would happen because it's not really a material thing. It's an idea, isn't it? Well, each one of us, I think we have a perfect, beautiful niche in God's creation. We're all needed. Like those men in that jail that day. They're beautiful, beautiful people, needed. And God needs them. God needs an expression. It's like you can't have a cause without an effect. And we're the effect of God. Like when you talk about the sun, you can't have a ray of light from the sun without the sun. But when you look at the sun, you see those rays of light. It needs its expression, even though it is one thing, the sun. And you could say, without going into all the physics of it, that the sun creates those light beams brand new out of its very own being every moment. And in many ways, my favorite chapter of the Bible is really the last one in the book of Revelation. It's at the very end of Revelation. And it talks about all these different forms of death and decay, sadness, being wiped away. And then it says, "Behold, I, God, make all things new." And that man that day in that prison, he was just new, like a child. So beautiful, just all life. Now, there's this image that people think about that I think relates a lot to birth and death, because when you think of Christmas, we often think about it as the birth of Jesus. And the birth of something can seem so beautiful and monumental. If you've ever had a child, you certainly remember the day that they were born. And if you ever get up early in the morning and watch a sunrise, that coming, that revealing of the sun, that birth of the sun, you could say, is this a magical moment. It's really wonderful. And also the sunset, that what appears to be the death of the sun, also is something you will remember. But if you think about the sun, it seems to go through the same cycles that our lives do. The sun looks like it comes out of darkness, just born out of nowhere, really. And it comes, rises to maturity, shines brightest, and then it starts to decay, and then eventually you see it passing on, no sun anymore. People back in the day, before they knew anything about astronomy and modern science, I think some of them probably thought that maybe it's a different sun each day, or that this is really the sun being born and getting stronger and then getting weaker and going away. But actually, even though we talk about it as rising and falling, the sun is not rising, it's falling. It's not being born, it doesn't die at another time. It's always just shining. It's always just shining. But how do we get that view? We have to get a higher, more heavenly view to actually see that. We have to get outside the Earth's atmosphere altogether. If we get outside the Earth's atmosphere altogether, if we went up into a rocket ship, as some famous people have done recently, and get a high enough perspective, we can actually just see the sun that is always shining. It never is rising or falling. There's never this period of darkness where the sun is just not shining that we seem to experience humanly. Never happens. But we get that from a higher, more heavenly view. I think Jesus, when he was praying, he was lifting himself up from the sod or materialism or limited or earthly viewpoints that we often look at life through to a higher, more heavenly view where he saw God and God's goodness being ever expressed. It doesn't come and go in our life. Good and bad are not opposites. God is good, so goodness is just ever present. It's always being renewed. It's always here. Love, it's not the opposite of hate. Hate is really nowhere where the true understanding of love is. Understanding and ignorance, no, it's just understanding, just the intelligence of God everywhere. And Mary Baker Eddy, she wrote in Science and Health that it is our ignorance of God, the divine principle, which produces apparent discord, and the right understanding of him restores harmony. The right understanding of God restores harmony. I just love that. And that really is a promise to all of us. The right understanding of God restores harmony. Well, I want to tell you a story about how this happened to somebody who Mary Baker Eddy really made a difference to. And this was an individual named Harriet O'Brien. She lived during Mary Baker Eddy's age. She was from from Kansas City. And this was a woman who just faced so much chronic illness in her life. She had chronic heart issues, chronic spine issues. She picked up what's called an iatrogenic ailment, something caused by medical intervention that went wrong. And she was someone who started to lose her mind, really. I mean, she actually stopped speaking. Her motor movements start to shut down. And when she seemed to be at death's throes, in her words, she was introduced to Christian Science, and somebody who was taught by Mary Baker Eddy started to pray for her. Very quickly, she started to revive, and before she knew it, she was healthy again. And it was so wonderful. And yet she was still in this wheelchair. It was thought that she would never walk again, I think. And she kept praying week after week, month after month. Didn't come quickly, but eventually she got up out of that wheelchair, started to walk normally. It was such a wonderful transformation that she said she had to relearn how to talk, relearn how to write. And she did. She became a wonderfully successful and helpful person. After that healing, shortly after that healing, she really wanted to meet Mary Baker Eddy, as you could imagine. She wanted to get to the source, I think. And when she met Mary Baker Eddy, this is what she wrote about this remarkable experience. She said, "Transparency is the word that best expresses my impression of Mrs. Eddy. Instinctively, I felt her great love, and I was conscious that no one I had ever seen loved me as much as she did. My entire thought was filled with a spiritual illumination, and there was a glory in the sunshine landscape, as though a breath of heaven had swept earth and enveloped me." There's so many things there. I love that idea that she felt that she loved her more than anyone. And this was without Mary Baker Eddy ever even talking to her. Well, how could that be? Well, Mary Baker Eddy, I think she really knew God and what God expressed looks like and is, and really knew generically what the individual of God is. And she progressed so much in her own spiritual journey that she was able to express a remarkable degree of patience and transparency. And often people described when they were talking to her like that it felt like there was no one else in the world except the two of them. Just a wonderful concentration on the goodness and the actuality of individual eternal presence. And what's interesting to me is that there have been a lot of sages and yogis and apparent enlightened people over the years who have had some degree of spiritual understanding. I mean, this is universal after all, and many people in different traditions have caught some of what Mary Baker Eddy has called the perfection that underlies reality. Without perfection, nothing is wholly real. And often being in the presence of someone who knows a lot about divine love, divine perfection, you can just feel that health and goodness and joy being around them. But the problem is people often get addicted to their personality or get attached to them in an unnecessary way. But Jesus, he was a teacher. I don't think he wanted everyone just merely to worship him and to just say, I love Jesus, or I accept this about Jesus. I think he wanted people to learn to think and live like he did. I think that's why he took disciples and taught them. And even as actually after Jesus left, after Jesus was crucified, resurrected, and then wasn't there anymore, when he wasn't there anymore, that's when his disciples actually started to go out and heal, because they started to rely directly on God and what he was teaching all along. And that life of Jesus was a wonderful example to them. But they had to go and prove it themselves and learn step by step. Well, Mary Baker Eddy, when she met people, she really seemed to bring out the best in them. And they didn't get addicted to her personality. Again and again, Mary Baker Eddy was able to show how they too can be healers. And they can hear God directly without an intermediary. They don't have to wait just to what she was going to say to them to find healing or goodness in life. And Harriet O'Brien, that moment she met Mary Baker Eddy, she said she had a question that she was looking to answer when she met her. And the question was, can I be a healer too? The moment she met her, without words even being exchanged, she said, I knew the answer. and she hopped on a train shortly after, went back to her hometown, started a public practice as a Christian Science practitioner. And over the years, she healed many, many people. She was a public practitioner for over 50 years. Some of that time she worked personally for Mary Baker Eddy. And she said on several accounts, she was able to heal people who, like her, appeared to be on their deathbed, dying of something that was incurable or something very difficult. And she helped pray and revive those folks to harmony in a very natural and wonderful and non-physical way, just through Christian understanding and love, through divine science. So I'm going to open this up for questions now. I know a lot of people are thinking, oh, this is all great, but how do I apply this to my life here and now more? And how do I experience more of this oneness of divine love and this health that flows from Christian Science? So if you have any question, you can type it into the chat on YouTube, or you can email me, and I will answer the question. So it looks like we got one question that came in about what happens when people have a disease that's incurable and doesn't seem to go away. Well, I would say, one, that we want to cultivate the ability to love without condition. If love is conditional, then it's not real love. It's not the ever-presence of love that is God. Human love seems to be conditional. It's a quid pro quo deal. I'll love you as long as I'm getting love back. But love really is something so much more. There's a wonderful verse in, or a paragraph, I should say, in Mary Baker Eddy's writing. She wrote this book called No and Yes, in addition to Science and Health. And she says, true prayer is not asking God for love, but it is learning to love and to include all mankind in one affection. And so I think when we pray, we want to get the right concept of man, and then we want to keep giving out that love that flows from God. And so I've had many times when I've gone to hospitals or I've gone to people's homes where people are sick and have some chronic ailment, and just expressing patient love, just trying to give them what they're ready to accept in that moment, planting little seeds of inspiration. It can often bring life-transforming renewal and health. And sometimes it doesn't happen all at once, and sometimes it comes in baby steps. But I've seen many cases throughout my time as a practitioner where, just not buying into any material label, really begin to define them people as children of God, and then allowing yourself and them to begin to express these qualities of God that are truly good and infinite, that really flow from the source that is absolute, that doesn't have conditions. And that can just cause, transformation in a way that nothing else can. I have a case that comes to mind of a boy who seemed to have a medical condition that seemed to be incurable. He was in a hospital. There was a lot of different things in this case that seemed to be stopping or thwarting healing, and the parents were just so scared, and the boy was on so many drugs that he couldn't even talk to you. And I kept visiting him in the hospital, planting seeds, and it wasn't a quick or fast thing, but over time he fully and completely recovered from that ailment and actually finished college and is now off doing other things. And it's just wonderful how really expressing true Christian love and recognizing that this is not just up to chance, it's based upon what is true, it's based upon law, and carrying that with us can help us to compassionately express love in a way that really matters, that makes a difference, and that ultimately heals, that brings out harmony, real harmony. Okay, let's see if any other questions came in. Somebody was asking me about vaccines and Christian Science approach to vaccines. I would say that one of the things I love about Christian Science is that I grew up going to a variety of different Christian churches. My mom was kind of church shopping around, and I experienced a lot of different Christian pastors and leaders share political opinions during sermons and different outings and events. And that generally rubbed me in the wrong way, because I thought, Jesus, he didn't really talk about politics, what Roman laws should be or Jewish laws should be in terms of how to govern people. He talked about the government of God, the kingdom of God. And where people wanted him to become a king and to overthrow the Romans, instead of lifting himself up as this political ruler and governing people with an iron fist, no, he got down on his knees and he washed everyday people's feet. He took a totally different approach, not change the outside to then change people's lives. He started to change the inside right away. And I think that's the enduring way to approach spirituality, that it transforms us inside and out. And we don't have to worry so much about the politics, which always seem to change. But real spiritual truth is eternal. It's timeless. That's why we're still talking about Christianity and what Jesus taught today. Jesus said, "Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away." He really saw them as eternal, or not something that were born one day and then will die in another time. They're based upon the timeless truth of being, timeless love that underpins existence. And so Christian Science, it doesn't take a stand that some people need to take a vaccine, or we don't need to take a vaccine, or you need to do this or not do that. It really lets the individual choose for themselves and what's healthiest and best for their communities and family. And Christian Scientists are taught to be the most law-abiding citizens on earth, and also to be Christianly, to be neighborly, to be the best citizens that they can be. And so, even though most Christian Scientists rarely, if ever, rely on material medicine or a material procedure to bring about health in their lives, many of them, in a situation like this, may take a vaccine or take other precautions, like, of course, mask mandates, all that sort of thing, to assuage the fears of community members. They might even feel that they're fearful of this pandemic, and they just feel like it's the safest thing for themselves, and that's totally fine, totally acceptable. Other Christian Scientists, they might say, I've met some people who are, reserved, and maybe they're living in an area that's not around other people, and they feel like it's totally fine to, they've relied on God their whole lives and have found and seen healing again and again, relying on Christian Science, really brought a consistency, maybe generations of healing. And so they might not feel it's appropriate in their circumstance to take that vaccine. But totally up to individual choice there. I think it's very easy to get wrapped up in things like that, like political gossip and us versus them kind of mentality, a duality. This political party is into it, this political party is not into it, and what side are you on? That sort of thing. And Christian Science, it really tries to lift us above that, to really show how can we begin to think in a way that's going to bless everyone. And there are going to be some individual answers as that prayer is imparted by different individuals. Okay, let's see what else came in. I don't see another question, but I did have somebody ask me earlier about just church attendance. That I know the sponsoring branch who out in Baltimore, Maryland, who is hosting this talk, they were thinking about this as well. Just, it seems that religion is on the decline. Less and less people are coming to services, and sometimes there were big churches in the past, and a lot of them are smaller today. Well, and there can often be a feeling of depression there, a feeling of, we're losing here. Well, I like to recognize that in Jesus' life, that he wasn't attached to the numbers. When Jesus started teaching in a unique way that was unfolding this universal love, he might have been the only one doing it at the time. And he started to get big crowds when people were attracted to the miracles that he seemed to perform. And these weren't really miracles, they were divinely natural occurrences. When he was supplying for people and bringing out health and life where death and disease and lack appeared, that was all so natural. But people were attracted to that, big crowds were coming. But then he started to really go deep. He started to talk about people, if they wanted to follow him, they really need to take in his life example. And he used these vivid words, you need to drink my blood and eat my flesh. And he wasn't talking about cannibalism there. But people said, oh, this teaching is too hard, and people left him. And at the end of his life, there was only, not that many disciples left. There weren't big crowds following him anymore. And every one of his disciples denied him at the end. And so he was left alone again. But he knew that it was the right thing to go through that crucifixion and keep praying. And it was to prove that the oneness and the dominion of God, of eternal life. And that death doesn't have its last word, just like sickness doesn't have the last word in our life. And fear certainly doesn't have the last word in our life. The Bible says perfect love casts out fear. It also casts out ignorance and dis-ease and feelings and even the experience of death. It really brings us into the consciousness of the ever-presence of goodness and health, and that is really the true reality in every moment. And so when you see people worried about dwindling memberships and all that sort of stuff, I think it's good just to really be like Jesus. What would Jesus do? What would he think? Jesus, I think, would really focus on seeing God right here and now through individual perception. We're not saved collectively. We're saved one by one as we grow spiritually. What saves us is that spiritual concept of life that flows from the life of Christ Jesus and that was embodied in his life. And so I don't think we need to worry about what other people are doing. The focus of Christian Science and genuine spirituality is always, what are we doing? How are we discovering the kingdom of heaven within? And as we do that, we experience the joy of revival in our life. And we can experience that in our churches too. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. Today we've been looking at this prayer so close to my heart, the prayer that reforms the sinner and heals the sick, is an absolute faith that all things are possible to God, a spiritual understanding of him, and unselfed love. Well, some people ask me at the end of a talk like this, well, what words do you just say when you pray? What are the actual words? They often want a formula. And there are some wonderful things in the Bible, as well as in science and health, that are worth memorizing, worth keeping close to the heart, like the 23rd Psalm, 91st Psalm, maybe the Lord's Prayer in the Bible, all wonderful, strong prayers that can help us, full of wonderful ideas, transforming ideas, true ideas that are aligned with the eternal reality of life. But prayer is not just reciting words. Often we think of God, I think the reason why God is depicted as a person, or like with the words Father, for example, is that the way we relate to God is like a relationship. And if you have a relationship with someone, what does it take to have a great relationship? It takes having faith in them. It takes understanding them. It takes loving them. But there are no special words that create magically a perfect relationship. You can't say any sentence to someone and then perfect relationship. It just doesn't work like that. There are some words like I love you, I'm grateful for you, I appreciate you. Those are all good words to say to God, or phrases to say to God. But they don't automatically create a great relationship. What makes a good relationship with someone is having absolute faith in them. It's really being there for them. What did Jesus do after he resurrected? He came back to his disciples who had failed him time and time again because he loved them so much. He knew the best in them. He expected the best in them. He saw them as eternal ideas, needed to God, forever valuable, not based upon their past material experience forever. And right where people didn't have the right understanding of life, Jesus spent time with individuals, really to understand them. Understanding takes quality time sometimes. And what does it take to love? It takes getting rid of self that says, I'm in this box. Jesus didn't belong to any box. He loved in a way that seemed to be reckless to human sense. He loved in a way that broke down barriers constantly because it wasn't a material love. It wasn't a love, well, I'll love here in my church or in my community, but not over here. No. Infinite love, unself love. And faith, understanding, and love, that's what it takes to have a great relationship. And that's what it takes to have a great relationship with God, to begin to trust God. Because that higher, more heavenly view of life, God's view of life, that's what shows us what's true. Like the earth appears to be flat, but if you got a high enough or more heavenly view of it, you would see that it's a spheroid, and that's the truth of it. You're not changing a flat earth to a spheroid by doing that. That higher view just shows us what's true. So trusting in God, it will show us more of what's true in life. And understanding God, that's where science and health comes in so beautifully. That really helps us understand the true nature of God. Mary Baker Eddy, when she taught classes, and when Christian Science teachers all around the world today teach classes on Christian Science, they begin with that definition of God, usually for a day, if not more, exploring that before doing anything else. So important to really understand God. And then to express God, to love, to actually live it. So important. It can't just be abstract philosophy. And when you have faith in God, understand God, love God, express that love of God, that is going to make you feel incredibly close to the divine. And you're going to see healing naturally and continuously in your life. So I hope you got a better sense of what healing through Christian Science looks like today. I hope you caught some of that all is light, all is calm Christian spirit listening today. And I hope you walk away today just feeling deeply valuable and loved as a dear child or son or daughter of God. Again, a big thanks to the sponsors of this event, First Church of Christ Scientist in Baltimore, Maryland. Again, their website is christiansciencebaltimore.org. I hope you get to check that out. There'll be a replay of this event there. Also online, you can check out christianscience.com if you want to learn more about Mary Baker Eddy, or find a service or a practitioner, or maybe even a Christian Science nurse near you if you're needing some practical care. And you can check out jsh.christianscience.com online. And one of Mary Baker Eddy's last achievements was actually creating the Christian Science Monitor. And so you could also check out that wonderful newspaper that's really trying to break down the divisions out in the world and bring out the good that's going on and help, show and highlight the practical solutions that people are working on to really bring harmony and break down barriers in thought. You could check that out at csmonitor.com. Again, thanks to you for tuning in, and have a wonderful, wonderful Christmas season. Thank you so very much.